Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. I am your host and beat reporter, John Shipley, and I have been your beat reporter covering the Jacksonville Jaguars for On SI every single day since August 2019, and we are continuing to march forward through yet another season together. As always, you can find our 24/7, 100% free, boots on the ground coverage of the Jacksonville Jaguars when you follow us on social media such as Facebook and Twitter at Jaguars on SI. You can also find us at www.si.com/NFL/Jaguars. All right, folks, welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. Today we are going to talk about the official ringing in of Week 1 for the Jacksonville Jaguars. It is the first week of the 2025 NFL season. The Jaguars will obviously play later this week, Sunday afternoon, 1 p.m. against the Carolina Panthers at Everbank Stadium. And Week 1, to me, is always one of the most important weeks of the year. It doesn't make or break your season. Because, we saw in 2022 the Jaguars lost in Week 1 to Carson Wentz and the Washington Commanders in a sloppy game. Jaguars end up going 9-8 and winning the AFC South and going to playoffs that year. 2023, the Jaguars beat up on the Colts in Indianapolis. The Jaguars end up going again 9-8 but missing the playoffs. And then last year was kind of the counterexample. Last year, to me, showed how Week 1, while it shouldn't define your season, it can set the tone for your season that, if you aren't careful, can quickly get dangerous. Now, we've talked about this before, but the Week 1 game for 2024, Jacksonville at Hard Rock Stadium in Miami, it looked like the Jaguars were in control of the game. It looked like they were about to score, take a 2-touchdown lead, I believe it was, on Miami, and really effectively leave the game with a win. Instead, Travis Etienne fumbles the ball. I believe Javon Holland forced it. Miami recovers it, and this is near the goal line, so it's a 7-point swing. And then about a moment or two later, Tyreek Hill burns the Jaguars for a deep touchdown. That Travis Etienne fumble becomes a 14-point swing, and all the momentum went to the Dolphins. And you could tell the Jaguars, after that fumble, were simply out of the game. You could tell that the entire sideline had the air taken out of them, and they more or less were saying, here we go again. And as I've told you guys, I've spoken to people on that team last year in the locker room who said that was the feeling. That once he fumbled, and once they faced some adversity, one veteran player told me it felt like 2023 all over again. And the Jaguars never recover the rest of the year. They come out the next week against the Cleveland Browns and just look absolutely terrible. Flat and ineffective on offense. Trevor Lawrence missed a bunch of throws. They didn't make Deshaun Watson look good. He still looked awful. But Deshaun Watson looked better against the Jaguars than he had against a lot of teams. And the Jaguars lost a really, really sloppy and uninspiring game against the Cleveland Browns. Then the next week, get their doors completely blown off by the Buffalo Bills in one of the worst games I've ever covered. I wasn't there in person, and I thank the Lord above me that I wasn't. It was an absolutely brutal game. I didn't see the 2020 COVID one-win Jaguars get beat that bad. I saw the Urban Meyer Jaguars get beat that bad, but it was bad, people. And then the week after, they're 0-3. They go into Houston. And once again, self-inflicted mistakes, shooting themselves in the foot. They lose that game too. And in each of those losses, they looked like that Week 1 fumble was still affecting them. They looked like the other shoe had already dropped and they were playing simply because they had to. Not because they thought they could win. Not because they wanted to prove a point, but because they more or less were like, dang, we got 16 games left in this season. Let's go play out the string. That is what last season felt like to me. That once the Jaguars faced that adversity in Week 1, they never recovered. And I am a firm believer that how teams respond to Week 1 will show you how good of a team they'll be in Week 8. In Week 12, in Week 16. In 2022, the Jaguars responded to Week 1 by winning the next week. So to me, how a team responds after some early season adversity can really define their season. And that is why I think this week 1 game is critical for the Jaguars. I don't think that the Jaguars are in such a fragile space as they were last year, where it was clear when Etienne fumbled the ball, everybody watching that game knew that they were going to lose. I don't think the Jaguars are as fragile now. Part of it because they've overturned so much of the roster from 2022, from 2023. I have they call it, the flip book each week, where they'll have one side of it is devoted to the starting offense and defense of the team and their entire roster. And then the other side is devoted to the starting offense and defense and the entire roster of the other team. And I have a 2022 flip book hanging in my office, framed, from when the Jaguars played the Kansas City Chiefs in the divisional playoff game. Several years ago now. 3 seasons ago. And when you look at it now, most of those names are gone. There's a few that are still there. Trevor Lawrence is still there. Walker Little's still there. Travis Etienne is still there. Josh Hines Allen, Trayvon Walker, Foye Oluokun, Devin Lloyd, Tyson Campbell, Andrew Wingard. All those guys are still there. But the bulk of the guys who overcame that adversity in 2022 and the bulk of the guys who struggled to handle adversity in 2023 and then the next year are gone. The Jaguars had, I believe, 26, 27. It was one of those 2 new players on the roster this year who were not on the 53-man roster last year. I don't have the data in front of me to compare that to other teams with new regime changes. But I do think this is a team that has a new mentality because so many of these guys didn't go through what they went in 2023. Didn't go through what they went through in last year's season opener. But I'm still a firm believer that this year's season opener against the Carolina Panthers can set the table, set the tone, and really define the rest of the Jaguar season. To me, the Carolina game is one of the most winnable games on the Jaguar schedule. As you guys know from listening to me, I'm not a Bryce Young guy. I just, the time I viewed him live against the Jaguars a couple years ago when he was a rookie is one of the most brutal watching experiences I've seen. And then what he did last year, he gets benched after starting terribly. And then to me, he went from being one of the worst starting quarterbacks in the NFL to improving and being one of the starting quarterbacks in the NFL. Not great, not awful. It's kind of there, in my opinion. I'd say Bryce Young, if I had to rank the 32 starters, is somewhere between 24 and 28. I just simply do not believe that Bryce Young is this ascending talent who is set to take the league by storm and who had an amazing second half of the season last year. I just don't think so. And I don't think much of a lot of the pieces Carolina has around him. Xavier Legette, I'm way down on. I think he was one of the worst first-round picks last year. He had a really tough rookie year. And you look at some of the recent moves of the Panthers, Coker is now on IR. Will miss the game due to a quad injury. Adam Thielen, very old and not exactly a game breaker, but he was productive, and he obviously had the trust of Bryce Young. They traded him to the Minnesota Vikings. Dave Canales, I think, is probably a average level head coach at best. Their defense, they signed a lot of guys in free agency, but they signed a lot of B-level players. To me, not many game changers. So, I'm interested to see what this matchup looks like, but to me, this is a game the Jaguars should win. And if they don't, that would cause me concern for the rest of the season. Because you can see those losses fester. And maybe this team is mentally stronger than the last one. Maybe this team isn't as mentally weak and as fragile as the last locker room and regime. But until we see that they are, to me, you have to think that this week 1 game is incredibly important. They're all important, but I really think this game and starting off the new regime the right way is more important than most others. Thank you guys all for listening. That is all for today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. Please make sure you like, review, and follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on other podcast platforms.